He stands in front of me enlightened, or so he tells me. The air is thick with irony, while his tone suggests a union of my lips and his penis. Have you heard of a chakra? The enlightened one asks with a laugh. I have. I'm a non-believer. Spinning orbs by my heart, throat, and lonely sex seem too poetic to exist. Swallowing in lieu of speech, I quickly escape. Carefully, my tiptoes maneuver around muted colored mats in search of a refuge. The open-air shallow is full of ladies with a bristle I associate with survivors. The windows to the men's souls are either vacant or mischievous. One steals attention by leaping into a handstand. With a whoop, he returns to his unnecessary feet. A bro whimpers, then barks, then whimpers again. His round eyes are distracted by the curve of a beauty's back. Go to your mat, I do. I hope you're ready for this. I am. You'll have to learn to breathe, I know, and meditate, I hope, and learn about yoking of the mind, body, and spirit so you too, maybe, can become enlightened like me. There's a fury of flying lycra as everyone disrobes down to side boob and happy trails. Being a practice practitioner, I've accepted the unveiled love handle and the occasional freed nipple. If nipples could speak, they would say, remove me from these antimicrobial wireless cups so I may nourish the world.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 2 of our summer interview series. I'm Sarah Edmonds. I'm the editor-in-chief of For Page and Screen magazine. I'm here today with Leona Apps. She's the author of He Stands in Front of Me Enlightened, which we had the honor of publishing in issue 4. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
No problem. Thank you for having me. And thank you again for publishing this story. I'm so glad that it found a little home.
Yeah, I'm so grateful you sent it our way. I'm always in love with stories that take a really unique perspective on topics and look at things through a very unique lens. And we'll get into that, I'm sure. But to start off, I would love for you to tell me a little bit more about what inspired this story and how it came to you.
Well, when I used to live in London, I was actually heavily involved with the yoga community there for a while, and I trained to be a teacher, and I was sort of studying under a very intense, well-known teacher. And I found myself getting very interested in why people end up in that space. And and a lot of it, I think, has to do with sort of healing, whether that be sort of physical or emotional healing. But unfortunately, these places don't offer a one-fits-all kind of one-size-fits-all like answer to these issues. And so sometimes people come in with quite complicated trauma that they're trying to work through, and these spaces can actually open up these feelings, but not maybe have the space actually for healing or for really helping someone after the mat. And so I wanted to actually. And then I also am very interested in the story follows a protagonist who went through an emotionally abusive relationship. And what happens when you have somebody who is actually wrestling with something, trying to heal, trying to move on, trying to figure out their next step. And then they find themselves in this place that has the veil of help and healing, but maybe doesn't always have the ability to back it up. And those two spaces colliding was interesting to me. But yeah, I mean, there's an element of it also that's sort of a classic revenge tale a little bit about somebody. And that too is interesting, the idea of who and why we take revenge out on certain people, and maybe they're not the person that actually did the harm to begin with. But yeah, so that's the sort of the nuggets or the things that I was interested in exploring. I'm also, it's a dark satire. There's like there's moments that I hope that it's also funny, and that is to me a theme in a lot of my work where I look at people that use a sort of wit or dry wit to handle the muddier sides of life and how they negotiate the sort of more darker spaces in the world. And I think, that to me, that's a very human space to come from. I hope that answered it. I don't know if you have any additional.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. And like you were talking about this kind of emotional journey that the main character is going through. Did you find it difficult as the author kind of figuring out the emotional pathway from start to
Mm.
finish, dealing with the balance of wanting to heal, wanting revenge, all of the complex intricacies? Was that difficult for you as the author trying to balance all of that?
I think a little bit. I think the most challenging thing for me is by the time I was writing this story, I was a little bit removed from this yoga community, and I now live in LA, and which is the prime space of sort of quote unquote, mindful living, quote unquote, whatever that means. And I have quite a lot of cynical leftover relationship with that, and I see a lot of insincerity in it. And I think that also that with profiting and selling, mushroom coffee or whatever it be, and the overlaps there is a complicated world. So my biggest challenge was to not imprint too much of my own, to have her be cynical of this world and be going through something, but also to understand that everyone else in the story is going through something and trying to sort of balance, so it's not just sort of an outright attack on this world. I guess that was my biggest challenge, and to really put myself in the protagonist's shoe and go like, well, she has gone to this retreat for a reason. So what is she really going to take out of it? And she becomes very extremely angry and about 3/4 of the way through, or 2/3 of the way through. And so I guess the thing I was playing with a lot is how I was going to end it. Was I going to leave her with anger, or was I going to somehow release it? And then when I came to the conclusion that I wanted her to release it, then it all sort of fell into place a little bit. Um, and also this idea, there's a theme of animals throughout it, and I parallel a lot of people to animals, and this idea that she is somebody who hasn't, because of the experience she's had, she's never really realized what her sort of animal self can do, which in this story is flight. And at the end, you know, she finally figures out how to at least fly for a second.
Absolutely. That was going to be my follow-up question. I want to talk a little bit more about the animal imagery,
Yeah.
because I think it does so much for this, not for the story, might be the wrong phrasing, but it does so much in the story, equating these different characters to animals and kind of the archetypes that we have associated with the animals that you pick. The
Mm.
um, fox, I believe, for the teacher, if I'm
Yeah.
remembering right. Bird
Yes.
for the main character, the puppies, the dogs, all of that. And I'm
Mm.
curious, how did you land on that? Was that something you started with? Did it kind of develop as you were writing?
Well, I think it really lends itself for the space of being, because it's framed around these yoga practices that she's doing in the early morning on this retreat in India. And it really lent, because when people I mean, I maybe am a little bit of a person that is like, oh, parallels people to animals anyway, but especially when people are moving, or how they take up the space physically, or how they like, it's like you can't hide who you are at that point. And I mean, the idea of her not being able to fly, I think, was first, but then actually before I really landed on the teacher being the fox, um, which I just loved the idea of him having this very long, beautiful tail that he smacks around the place sort of willy-nilly, not really being aware of who it could, how it could harm. But I think that really it was the bro, the guy that was so eager, because that's a type of guy that I meet, and you never really know because they have so much energy and forward facing love and cuteness, but then their loyalty can lead them astray, and that's what was so important about that character. So he was really the first one that I was like, and there was definitely people that I've met that character resonated at. Like, always feel like they're doing it, but really he's so loyal to the teacher. That's his primary thing, that he can't quite help do anything completely right. That's his loyalty is the primary characteristic, even if you're a lawyer loyal to the wrong to the wrong person. I mean, I say it in the script, but in the script, in the story, I said, even Hitler had dogs, which is true. The dogs can be very loyal, even if it's not to the right person. Anyway, but yeah, so I think that was my opening space in. And then once I sort of open the animal space, then everybody, fit into the right place.
Mhm. Absolutely. Now, I'm curious. I'm sure that positive that you said this in your cover letter when you sent us this story, but that was a while ago. Do you consider this story a piece of genre fiction?
I'm a little bit. I mean, for me, there's elements of it that's like, that's a little bit magic realism. But to me, there's an element of it being a sort of revenge thriller in bits, and it doesn't really start off for that, but that I think is the genre. That's the journey for the main character is that she embraces that. And there is a period when she really wants to hurt him. Obviously the story takes a different direction, but for me, it is, I mean, I'm always sort of playing, with my films or my prose. I like to play with genre. I never feel that I'm ever completely sitting in it in a way that people that are sort of, I don't know, even know the word purists for those genres would maybe even recognize it as them. But I do like to sort of play with the tropes of genre quite a lot and introduce it. And I think they're very powerful tools, actually.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
consider it genre fiction?
I I don't know. I think that was one of the things that I personally really loved about the story was kind of when I first started reading it, I was like, I was unsure if I was supposed to be taking the animal imagery seriously. And not seriously, but like literally. At,
Yes.
I'm like, and I feel like even with the whole tail thing, I feel like I was still on the edge for a while. Like, is this, are they actually? And I kind of love that. I love that because it, I don't know, it just added layers to it. And as someone like I love kind of blending the lines between genres and between what's literary, what's I don't say what's not, but um, between what's genre and literary. I could go on a rant about that. We're not gonna we're not gonna
Yeah.
do that this different time. Um, but I love that you play with that, and I think that's a huge appeal for the story is that kind of like blurred line and playing with the tropes, making it feel familiar while also kind of being unsettled. Like, how are we supposed to see these people? How are we supposed to see these characters? Kind of vagueness in there, even though it's not vague, but it's where my mind goes to it.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, I know you've mentioned, and I know from emails, that you also do work in film. I was wondering, I want to ask you more about that, but first, I'm curious, not, do you think of yourself first as an author or a filmmaker, or both?
Ooh, well, I mean, I've done filmmaking for longer. I would say that at the moment, I really consider myself a writer first and foremost. Like for the longest time, I would have put directing as my primary thing, but the big shift happened with me about 5, 6 years ago when writing became a primary thing. So I write prose. I've written a novella that I'm aiming to publish, and I've write a whole bunch of other short stories, but I also write feature scripts. And then now I've got an Audible podcast that I've been working on, which is for a fiction Audible podcast. So there's, so I don't know. I guess I probably consider myself more of a filmmaker still, but writing is kind of taking over as sort of more of an umbrella category now. The thing that the thing about writing prose versus scripts, though, is that they do lend themselves to different stories quite heavily. Like I don't think this short story would work as a script in the same way at all, you know. So in a way, sometimes I think prose is an outlet, or maybe what drew me to it originally was an outlet of things that are very complicated to do in scripts, that are very difficult. You know, when you can sort of get behind you can get a certain level behind a character. And also I do love um satire. I love being a little bit pitchy. And if you put that in the mouth of characters, like in a movie, which you can do. I mean, obviously Fleabag is one of the, and she's a very satirical, voiced character, but it's a challenge, right? Because you're playing with if you're dealing with characters that are both witty and a little like sardonic or whatever, you're playing with the audience's care for those people, right? So when in prose, you can really embellish that, I find, you know, and especially if you then turn it on its head, or like in the novella I wrote, it like, you know, it's a changing narrative. So you can then see it from a different perspective, and then you can like, you know, judge or question how much you can believe the narrator that you were listening to. So those sort of games I really enjoy in prose. And yeah, it's much harder in film to do that sort of stuff.
Definitely. Now, when you start off with a new story, do you start off by saying, I want to write a film, I want to write a short story, or do you start with the story idea and then figure out which medium is best suited? How do you decide which to pursue?
Hmm. I would say usually I really approach things primarily from an idea of a topic that I want to discuss. And I know it's sort of backwards from way some people, a lot of, like, especially, you know, fellow script writers I know, they'll be very much like plot forward. Like, this is what's happening, this is the plot. Sometimes that comes kind of at the same time, um, but I think the topic tends to pull you in a direction or not. And if the topic is like a little bit more of a cerebral conversation, then I think that I always sort of end up putting that into prose. The other thing I like about prose is I like to play with a little bit of magic realism. And that again also is very tricky to pull, or you're in a huge budget, you know, so in film. So I think the topic already starts to sway you one way or another, whether it be prose or script. Yeah. And the other thing, I mean, and I don't want to say that books are not visual, because of course they are. But there is, when you're writing a script, this pull toward, like, you feel, I will have scenes in my head that have a massive visual component that I'm working towards or whatever, and they will come and pop out when I guess that sort of same, the appreciation of that in prose is playing with the language around those stories, you know, like feeling, you know, how, like, for example, in this story, building up the language around the animal sort of metaphors, or are they actual animals? Like that sort of gameplay makes that story fun to write. So it's like, you know, when you're writing a script, you go, oh, I can imagine, for example, this manor house being set ablaze. Well, that's going to be so much more powerful as a visual image than you know, and you can imagine working towards these sort of heightened moments that you visually impact you. So don't know if that answered your question, but I tried.
No, absolutely. You did. You did. Yeah. So to maybe back up a tiny bit, I'm curious, how did you first get into writing or filmmaking, whichever came first?
Um, I actually did a MA in filmmaking in my early 20s at the London Film School. And at that time, I was very focused towards directing. That was like, even when I was a kid, I used to be like, I want to be a director when I grow up. And I'm pretty sure it was before I really knew what a director was. But it was something that at some point, I really liked the idea of sort of authored filmmakers, writer, directors, which I think, I'm not the first person to have said that for sure. But this idea, I grew up as like a very big, like, I remember being like the films of like Cronenberg when I was young, and these sort of dark, like these sort of dark art house cinema, and that have something mainstream about it. And so I really was drawn to that. So I did an MA in filmmaking, and then and that I graduated as a director. And then I was like writing and directing in London for a long time, but I actually moved primarily through, because in England they have council funding. So I was actually funded primarily by the Arts Council, which, so a lot of it sort of what they call moving images. And then at some point, I got the bug. I started writing my first feature film, and then I got the bug of sort of really writing these longer pieces. And I think I was late to go to prose because I was a little nervous about it. I think because I didn't have the intimidating factor of prose writing is that there's so many people that have this very like, I've gone to done the MFA, like this route that if you're not part of it can seem a little bit like, oh, have I gotten the stuff that I need to be in that group? And then I got a few stories that I was just started writing. And then once I started writing, I was like, I absolutely love this. But it was only about 6 years ago that I really started to embrace writing prose and wrote a novella over COVID, and then really sort of realized my love of playing with language in that way, that you just don't get the same. You can play with dialogue a lot. That's very powerful, but it doesn't scratch the same itch, I should say.
No, I completely understand that. I actually had a very similar experience as a writer where when I was in like middle school and high school, I wrote short stories and like tried to
Yeah.
write novels and all that. But then getting into college, I was like, I very much had this idea of who writers were, and I'm
Mm,
like, I don't have that. Like, the haughtiness, for lack of a better word,
mm.
kind of like the literary and writing from life. I'm like, I don't really have that. So I got involved in film and like did primarily focus on script writing, did film um all throughout college, a year after college, and then just kind of like picked up prose writing again on a whim. And I'm like, you know what? Oh well, this is fun.
I
Very
do think it
similar.
is. They really did. I mean, I was doing it also, I did my A-levels in England, and England is very, I mean, half British and half Canadian. And my British side, England is very ownership over like literature. It's very, and I remember being like 16 and in this sort of literary classes. And and the feeling was, oh, you're not an expert in, Chaucer and Shakespeare. Well, then are you part of this? Are you allowed into this club? But and filmmaking, although can be very clubby and very hard to get through gatekeepers for sure. It's not in the same. It's not gatekeeped in the same way. And and I don't know. I think if you write a good book, I think you write a good book. Like that's the thing. And the other thing is that sometimes these things are great, these paths that are very rigid to get you things, but it's also sometimes people, like sometimes that can push you into ways of looking at things that can be limiting without, and I'm not in any way saying, obviously there's loads of fantastic writers that have gone down that route, but kind of coming about it by the backward approach and then going to things like the community of writers afterwards. I was kind of learning on the go, and I think it kept I mean, for example, this story is written in first, in first person present, which is classically like shamed by the literature circles. And I mean, I think it is opening up a lot, but for me, if you're talking about abuse, this is like one of the best ways to talk about abuse. And it seems like the most natural space. And other things I write are in third person past, of course, but this is like you're very close to it, but because you're very close to it, it is, I think when people are going through healing, whatever it is extremely present, that experience. It's happening. And so it puts the reader like right there. And so it does feel a little bit more like a script, like reading or watching a movie, because you're there with this is not a reflection on somebody healing from abuse. This is someone figuring it out with the reader while they're doing it. And it would never even occurred to me to feel that first first person present was in some way gauche, like, so, and that's a very minor example, but I do think, sometimes sometimes education is fantastic, but sometimes you have to make sure that the education doesn't like push your thoughts so much in a certain avenue that you can't even explore other ones anymore, so or maybe that's what I tell myself because
Yeah, honestly, I feel like you're spot on. I definitely kind of relate to that very well because I remember talking to some of the creative writing professors at my undergraduate university. I never took any of their classes. This is like far after the fact.
yeah.
Um, absolutely none of them enjoyed genre fiction. And I'm like, as someone who writes mostly fantasy, horror,
Hmm.
sci-fi, I'm like, I couldn't imagine if I had gone through those classes, like, would it have reshaped the way I think about the genres and like the way I write and kind of like
100%.
yeah, and I know I did have a professor who got an MFA in creative writing, and he specifically said he's like, I kind of regret it because they only wrote memoirs, and I do not like writing memoirs. And I'm like, okay, so that was not worth it for
I
you.
think you absolutely when you talk about genre, it's so important because and this also happens in film. Like one of the films that came out that I think is one of the most interesting conversations about gender, and it's written by a man and directed by a man, was Barbarian. And it's a horror movie. And it's a fascinating film, but I think it's so funny when I bring it up in certain circles. It's a fascinating film structure wise. It's a fascinating film and what's it saying? It's saying, oh, is it? And I've brought it up in situations where people are always surprised that you're bringing up a horror film. And I'm like, if you're not paying attention to genres, then you are not, and I think this goes for both, then you're also not paying attention to why people like need genres for certain topics. Because some of these topics, if you handle them in like thick drama, they are either too much or they're too alienating or they feel like homework sometimes for people, and and sometimes like these things like these tools can they grease the wheels a little bit and they make things and therefore you can go a little deeper. I think it's wild how they're sort of underestimated. That's interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree. I completely agree. I know this is a little bit of a tangent. Um, but one of the classes I teach looks at queerness and horror fiction, and
Mhm.
it's an English class, so like we read books, but we also um we watch Blackula, which is an interesting film to show like underclassmen at college because they often have never seen a 70s blaxploitation film. Like they've
Yeah,
never
yeah, I
nothing.
bet.
Um, but it's fascinating because we get into like topics of like gender, sexuality, specifically tied to race, because we watch it after reading Dracula and just having the contrast there and like how does race change gender relations, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
In different time periods, different cultures, of course, but um and like those are conversations that I'm having with like 18, 19-year-olds. And I'm like, if I just kind of threw you into the deep end with a drama, would we be able to talk about that? Like, yes, we can laugh about the makeup choices in the movie, but then we can also talk about like why they're so bad and all of the different like reasons behind that, and the fact that like makeup was not made for Black actors at that time period. So like
Yeah,
all
yeah,
of
yeah,
that.
yeah,
So it's a
for
great
sure.
vehicle to kind of dig deeper in that way.
Yeah. Oh, I gotta rewatch that. I don't think I've seen that movie for 20 years. But yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. And I'm sure because also if you set, the thing is that serious conversations are serious conversations, and they can also shut some people up, Not everybody feels if you set the stage as like we are now in a heavy drama and having a serious conversation about this subject, then it closes some people down. For Barbarian, I think is a great, because I mean, there's lots of different ways of talking about Barbarian, but what I find very interesting is this idea, which I'm absolutely not the first person to say this, but this idea that the woman is in jeopardy. Have you seen it? It's very good. I
I'm
think it's
not sorry.
no, it's fine. But the woman character is in jeopardy, whether she's with a nice man or a bad man. Like she is still in danger because of the circumstance of like that. Even the kind-hearted guy is underestimating how in danger she is. And that sort of subject is such a nuanced conversation about gender. And it would be a wildly alienating conversation to have, I think, with a lot of men, even if they'd be open for a lot of conversations to really start that off. But by seeing ultimately the good guy still wants her to come down to the basement, like because what's wrong with you? Just wait, I'm just going down to the basement. And her initial feeling constantly is to get the hell out of this situation because she, as many people like, and I think a lot of women have experienced maybe on the daily basis, this in tune concept of what's a scary situation and trying to get out of it. It's interesting. Check it out and we'll talk again. But it's a good example of that, because I think if you went at that conversation in a drama, it would be very obtuse and alienating for people to talk about. But somehow that movie does it, while also, being fun.
Definitely. I will have to watch it. It has been on the list.
Yeah.
You have persuaded me to
Now
move.
I've picked it up too much. No, but I did enjoy it. I did enjoy it. I was just surprised. When you're just like, good job. Congrats.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, so to maybe come back to your work for a second, are there any, I think you mentioned this at the beginning, so forgive me if I'm asking you to repeat yourself, but are there any themes that you find kind of carry across the different works that you do, whether across forms, across genre, anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do. I'm interested in gender. I'm also interested in, I mean, I've been working on a few things that are period pieces. And like this Audible piece is very, very, I mean, I can't talk too much about it. It's a very fictionalized retelling of a true poisoner that existed. But so I'm interested in the idea of, I think we always, and it's a human condition, but we believe that right now is the most modern. Everything is being, now is when all like everybody's rebellious and everyone's radical and everyone's pushing against the system. But in truth, like whatever, people have always been fighting these systems and in much more dangerous times in some of these cases. And so that's what a theme that I think I'm always interested, like how, people pushed back against circumstances over time. Other themes, I mean, right now, I'm very interested I'm writing a movie script that's a movie script, a feature script that's really talking about the subject of grooming. And I'm talking specifically about grooming of young women, sort of 14, 15, and the acceptable level of that exists in society, and questioning that. So I do really like to sort of put a different angle on sort of certain status quos and questioning, like, okay, we've accepted that there's a certain level of sexualization of 15-year-old girls that should be allowed. And why is that? And what danger does that make? And again, that's much a bit of a thriller. And like, what does it mean when people push against these systems? So that definitely runs through my work. I also am very interested in humor. I like to see how humor play. Like, so I use a lot of my characters use humor as like a means of survival. So they're not always the shining nicest people. And that to me feels very human too. So and maybe a little bit of myself coming through. So yeah, yeah, I think so. I can't think of any other themes off the top of my head that roll through my work, but something like that.
Definitely. I could definitely see a lot of those kind of playing through this story as well.
Yeah.
Um, Definitely. And yeah, I don't think anyone is really a perfectly nice person. So that does feel very, very human to me. I know I'm certainly not.
Exactly. And I'd be very suspicious of someone that was as well.
Same, same. But yeah, you've mentioned the podcast and the I almost said movie script too, the feature script you're working on. Do you have any projects kind of in the works or set for release soon that you are able to talk about?
Well, the main thing I've been working on is that Audible podcast, but I'm writing two scripts, and I've got the novella that I'm aiming to get published. So those are the main things. So I've got two scripts that are both, one of them is discussing this kind of concept of grooming that is heavily based around, because I grew up in Hong Kong, and when I went to move to England when I was 16 years old, I found myself at the school where I knew a lot of girls that were 16 and they were dating much older men, and their family knew about it. And at the time I thought, oh my gosh, I'm so much less mature than my peers. And now I look back at that whole time with a totally different lens. And I really like it. So, but it is, I mean, it's playing, and that again, much like this story, it plays with the trope of an ingenue, and like, what is an ingenue, and does a world allow an ingenue really to exist? Because if you're innocent, even if you're outside of the mechanism, are you still innocent because you're aware of the mechanism, if that makes any sense? But it's playing with the concept of these sort of film noir tropes. And another script that I'm writing it's hard to explain without getting too far into the plot, but I'm fascinated with the sort of rising concept of these sort of incel young men, and I wondered what it means if you peg like an incel young man against a mother, like a woman who is sort of in the prime of trying to give them to care and sacrifice and all these things that we sort of associate with motherhood, and then a young man who is rising hatred towards women, and what does putting these two people through the same experience together, what does that look like? And again, that's like quite a straight thriller, but yeah, so those are the two scripts that I'm working on, and I hope that they'll be made in the next couple of years, and I hope I get to direct one of them. And the other thing is the novella that I wrote, which is called Monsters of the Black Box, and that is a lot more lighthearted. But it's also someone dies in it, but it's a magic realism kind, a little bit more in tune with this story. It's set in LA, and it's about a man who is in his middle age, and he's just getting a divorce, and he discovers the improv classes that are all over LA, and he decides to reinvent himself as a comedian at, at approaching 50. And really for me, that that the novella is about, it's this sort of fun story. It's very LA, it's very about fame, it's about, comedy, but there's also, and I'm such a huge comedy file. I love stand up, and I remember like when I first heard stand up when I, was a teenager. I remember when I first heard Bill Hicks, it changed my life. I'm scared to go back and listen to him now, and I'm sure some of it hasn't aged well. So please, no one come for me. But I remember at the time when I listened to Bill Hicks, I was so, wow, this is so radical. Like stand up has a space that allows such radical conversation, and it can really push society forward and really open doors. But at the moment, a lot of comedians that I grew up with are going the opposite way. They're closing doors and shutting down and trying to move society backwards. And so really the conversation is like, happens when you put sort of this boomer Gen X kind of aged comedian in this, or somebody who's trying in a space with loads of Gen Y, and like what happens when you try to push these things backwards, which is what I keep seeing this conversation happen. So it's really discussing, I mean, I probably don't even have to mention names because we've all seen the articles, but like, there's so many comedians at the moment that are like, no, stop society, don't move past me. When I actually think that the interesting thing about comedy is when it puts cracks in society with momentum and makes you reconsider things in a radical way. And that makes it seem very intellectual, but actually it's really kind of a monster story. So the building of a monster from all that. Maybe you already know the plot.
I love that. I love everything about that. I love how it starts out monsters and you're like, it's really lighthearted. I love it.
Yeah, that's really fun to write. I really enjoy writing awful men. It's a joy. Not that all men are awful, just I enjoy writing the awful ones, like writing their dialogue. So,
I love it. I love it. I understand. Great. Well, best of luck. You'll have to keep us, by us, I mean me, generally, the magazine, the listeners at large, mainly me, posted when the films are made, when the novella is released, because I want to read and watch them. That sounds so fun.
thank you. I will do.
Yeah, definitely, please. So yeah, you've talked a little bit about the work that's kind of in the works. Could you tell me a little bit about where our listeners can find you, where they can watch and read what you already have out there? I'm curious. I'm sure we all want more.
Well, I have my debut feature came out about 5 years ago. It's called And Then I Was French. It's again genre playing. That seems to be the theme. It's a rom-com turned on its head and put through the thriller sort of horror lens. And the idea is like my age, I grew up with loads of rom-coms, which was like girl saw guy, girl transforms everything about herself for guy. And basically my movie posits like, well, could that not have a very negative outcome? Actually, if you alter everything about yourself, what does that unleash? That's level of transformation. And then a couple years ago, I mean, actually about last year, I think, I have a short that came out called Ages of Man, which I think is going to be up on the internet soon. It's three little vignettes that are, again, it's sort of a satire horror maybe that plays with the idea a little bit with the idea of the invisible labor of women, but it also posits the idea of putting three different men in vulnerable, dangerous situations with women, and then being unexpecting of it. And some of those dangers are more emotionally based, some of them are actual danger, and how these guys relate to it. So if you, you can follow me on Instagram, but the other thing, which is just Leona apps, but the other thing is that you can look for updates on my films on dogearedfilms.co.uk.
Awesome. And we can absolutely link that as well. We can link any websites, anything when
Okay.
we post this too. So I will make a note of that. But yeah, absolutely. Everyone will have to check them out. I will certainly check them out. Um, Really quickly, last question on my end. If you could give any one piece of advice to writers, filmmakers, we'll open the category broad, what would it be?
I think for writing, and this I think works for both prose and script writing. I think the main important thing is to get something down. And I know I think people can get so, I've known so many creatives throughout my life that are so scared, and I don't think they would maybe look at this as fear, but that's how maybe I interpret it. They're so scared of thinking about how people are going to review everything afterwards. Like, are they going to think I'm genius enough? Are they going to think I'm creative enough? Are they going to think that it sort of becomes a polarizing state? When really, and maybe I learned this from my years of being in film, is that so much of things is about editing and reviewing your work. And so if you want to be a writer, then write something, write anything, write as fast as you can, and then review it and take time and let it sit and then review it again and then work on, you're going to mold something out of clay. You have to start molding it. And I think that one of the things which it's like sometimes I meet, especially in film, I meet people that say, "Oh, I really want to write this, but I hate writing." And this is actually something I hear. And I'm like, well, I mean, imagine if I said, I really want to be a musician, and I really want to be a guitarist, but I hate practicing the guitar. Like it doesn't, there's something is awry. And maybe that means that you need to bring other creatives into your life that help with this. Or the other thing is that maybe you haven't practiced enough to know if you like it or not. Because I think, and I, again, using this music parallel, even though I in no way a musician, I think probably maybe everyone starts starts off hating learning to play the guitar, right? Like at the beginning of all of these experiences, until you get to a certain space where it becomes something semi-natural, there is an element of labor to it. But the only way that you're going to reach that stage is by actually writing and not worrying like, oh my gosh, is this going to be a bestseller? Is this going to make the best movie ever? Those sort of thought processes will really be your worst enemy, I think. And you'll be spending your life wishing you've done something as opposed to doing something, and it may be being okay, and then do another thing, right? Like it's fine.
Absolutely. That's really, really great advice. I always think, um, I remember when I first started out in film, the I made this really, really terrible film. Like all the love to everyone involved, but like it was not good. And everyone who kind of saw it was like, but you made a film. And that's
Yes.
what matters, especially starting out. Like you can learn so much, like learned so much from that. It might not be good, but it was a film. It exists. And that's all that
Exactly.
matters.
And people that don't work in film or write, they look at it even that as an amazing, because like there's is not even doing anything that can't be. I mean, I get asked all the time, like, how do you come up with ideas? Like this sort of people, and I'm like, I think our brains just work very differently, because I think it's probably more of an obsession than it is like it comes from something deep inside you. I think if you want to tell stories, or at least in my case, I'm sure there's different people of different ways, but exactly, like accomplishing anything and getting, and also putting something out there, you know, is it take, again, what is that expression? You fail every task you don't try, or whatever. But I got that wrong, but you know the gist. But it's this idea that it's like, I think sometimes even the idea of putting out a short film that's not perfect, or and some of that has to do with fear of not getting the accolades that people want. But then even the accolades are rigged. I mean, so I don't even know in my cynical, like, like age at this point, I'm like, I don't even know if those are things to look at that heavily. I think it's better to focus on your work, put your stuff out there and try to grow and get closer to what you want to do, the sort of David Lynch viewpoint of it, than than letting all this exterior noise like kind of stop you, because they're always going to find somebody that hates what you do, but you're always going to find somebody who's like into it as well. So
Absolutely. I love that. And that sounds like a wonderful line to end on to me. So thank you
hope
again
this was
so much
okay.
for chatting. It's been great talking to you, getting to know you, all of
Yeah,
this. Thank you
yeah,
so much for doing this.
no problem. Thank you so much.